Hey guys, what's up and welcome to another exciting RMA Fire tutorial. By the end of this tutorial, you are going to learn how to render something like this. Alright guys, so Redshift in Houdini. I have done videos pretty much the same as this one in the past, but since then I've learned a lot of very interesting things that have become my go-to tips when I go into Redshift to render specifically geometry. We're going to cover how to, number one, prep your geometry. Number two, set up your camera parameters the way that I set mine up. Set up materials, set up lights, and a basic look into how to render in Redshift. So without further ado, let's come into Houdini and let's drop down a geometry node. And on this geometry node, you are going to find you're going to drop a file. And this is what we're going to use to load the geometry we're going to use to render. So in your assets, if you hit ship, and if you downloaded my project file, you create a folder, you drop down assets, you will be able to, just like me, click ship if you've saved your project file to so for example, you create a file, you save your Houdini project in there, and then you save a folder called assets. And that's kind of how you build a structure in Houdini. Now you can click ship and go into assets, and you can select the OBJ, which is the OBJ of this tiger or lion that I really like using for texture purposes. So we have our geometry brought in. It is very low information on the geometry, and that's because we're going to get that detail on our texture. First thing that I do is let's check the size, because we want to make sure that we always texture and light at a similar size. So we know this box is a 1x1 in meters, therefore our object is quite big. So I like to first drop a transform, move my center to origin, and then scale it down to a size that is somewhat close to a meter in size of the geometry that we're going to work with. So boom, we have our base geo. And then the second thing that I want to do is I always want to test my UVs. I see that this object has UVs, but if we drop down a UV quick shade, we'll be able to just double check what the UVs look like of the texture that we want to apply. And we have a Lion D, which stands for Lion Diffuse Pass. Let's have a look. And now we can test and see, oh, okay, the UVs on this object are working completely fine. Let's come out. If you hit U on your viewport, you can come out, and this is our geo. Now we're going to drop a camera down, and here's how you set up a camera for basic rendering in Houdini. So the first thing that I do is I go to my view and I set my resolution to 1920 by 1080, which is kind of the standard that I use. You can change your focal length here from 50. If you're working in Cinema 4D, your focal length is most likely going to start at 35 mil. So we have the camera, and then if you hit here and select camera, we're going to be looking through our camera. Now if you'll go into the parameters here, and if you lock it here, you will be able to see that they're going to change as soon as we move the camera. So I want to have my camera facing straight at the lion like this. And now what I like to do is always work with numbers that are easy to control. Therefore, something like this is very ideal, because it's very easy to animate, and I have a lot of control over, like, I know that the camera is basically facing straight at the object. So yeah, and then we're gonna tweak our rotation a little bit here like this. And then I'm gonna come out of the camera and I'm gonna set my Z depth. Now to set your Z depth, you hit space on the viewport and then you hit the letter Z, or you middle mouse, and you can see that if you select the Z here, focus handle, you'll get this cool handle where you can control your Z depth. Now let's set our Z depth to something like this to make sure that, like, we have a shallow Z depth. I always like working with shallow Z depths. And then if we go to Redshift, depth of field, this is where you're going to enable it. But I'm not going to enable it just now. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is lights. We need lights. So in Redshift, if you type RS, you'll find the different types of lights that you will find. RS light, RS dome, the portal, the sun, and the RS ES, which I honestly don't use these ones much. Most of the work that I do with an RS light and a dome. So rule of thumb, I always use a dome. I always want to have a dome in my scene. So we go to light and we select here our texture. Let's come here into like one of my HDRs, and you guys can use any HDR that you want. Assets, textures, HDR eyes, and I am just gonna use a basic studio light. So first thing that I like to do on my lights is I don't like to have it in my viewport like this, so I usually disable it from the viewport. And then on my environment, I turn it off here, or else when you render, you're going to get that texture in the background, and I find it very distracting. Now let's drop an RS light, and this is just, if you middle mouse and push it around, the regular lights. So I like to set up a 3-point light setup. That means we put a light here, and then if you hit light, you'll be able to control the intensity, the color based on either temperature or just changing the color here. You can make it visible if you want it, or invisible, or bidirectional, or one directional, meaning if you make it visible, when you render, you're gonna see the light. So I recommend by default keeping it off. Bidirectional I like because it doesn't matter. The light is going to be hitting in that direction and in that direction. What's that mean? Like, it means that your light can illuminate in both ways. So let's see. You can see here that it's illuminating through that way, and it's also illuminating in the other way. Otherwise, sometimes I used to put my lights and I thought it was emitting light, but it was shooting in the wrong way, and I hate that. Now on your scale, we're gonna change the scale, and you can change it to be a disc, a sphere, a cylinder, or emit by mesh. If you guys want to see something emitting by mesh, I want to cover some of those tips, just leave a comment and I'll do it. Let's move our light a little bit here. Let's reduce the intensity to, say, for example, on 11. Let's hit Alt on our viewport, duplicate the light, and like I said, we're gonna create a 3-point light setup. So let's place this light here on the other side, and let's go ahead and make this light less intensive. You always want to have one light that is stronger and one light that is a little bit less strong. Now the next thing is I'm gonna select them both. I'm gonna disable them from viewport so that they don't become distracting on my viewport. I'm gonna save, and then we're gonna go into our materials. And before we go into our materials, let's come here, select your UV quick shade, and copy it. Now let's hit materials, and here's the standard material that I like to use for Redshift. If you type RS standard material, boom, that's your standard material. And then you want to type Redshift material, and then on the Redshift material is where you connect the surface. So this is gonna be our base texture. Then we're gonna drop down an RS texture node, and here's where we're gonna paste the color of the line. So the diffuse path that we picked. If you hit here, you will see that you get all of the basic parameters, but I just want to connect this to my base color just to test out and see what we get. Now that is how you set up the base texture. Now we want to apply it to the object. You can either apply it out here on the render on the material, or you can come in here and type material, connect it in here, and then we're gonna set that material to render. Now we're gonna come into our camera. We still have our depth of field turned off. We have not enabled any of the tessellation in here, which we're gonna see in a second. But first, we want to go to our out, and we're gonna type Redshift. Now this is how you set up your rendering parameters in Redshift. Here's what I like to do. I like to first just render a frame, not frame range. Here's how you change your frame range so you can render animations. On the main, I'm gonna select my camera, and I'm gonna say camera 1. Cool, I'm rendering camera 1. On my output parameters, I want to change this so that it is set to $OS/$OS/$F if you want a sequence, or just simply EXR. So this is going to create a folder, and inside of the folder, it's going to name the render whatever I name it here. So if I call this lion, it's going to create a folder called lion, and then inside is going to say lion.exr. And if it is a sequence, you do $OS dot $F.exr. But we're just doing an image here. Okay, now on the Redshift, here's a few of the things that you want to know. Here's your threshold. If you increase this to 0.5, you're going to get less samples. If you reduce this number, so say low is 0.1, medium is 0.01, and I tend to always stay at a medium, not necessarily going over a medium often. Then your global illumination is usually always turned on, and here's how you enable your motion blur. And the deformation blur is always also an option here. If you go into your advanced tab, you can go into your motion and here enable the deformation and instancing for particles, but we're not going to cover that in this tutorial. In this tutorial, we're just covering our basics. So let's just save. Let's select the Redshift node here and say render view. And we're going to be able to just check our basic material with the diffuse, with the basic lights. And that's basically the first thing that I do. I want to make sure that my material is working, the lights are okay, and if the lights look okay on a basic thing without any texture, then it's very likely that once you apply the texture, it's only going to look better. So I've hit render, and I'm going to hit F on my viewport to just like frame the render on my viewport, and I'm going to go back to OBJ. Well, off the bat, without tweaking anything, you will see that with those simple things, you've already got quite a decent image going for you. I'm gonna make this a little bigger, and I'm gonna hit F. Now, we know that this mesh is very low resolution. We couldn't even see the detail unless we applied a texture to it. So I'm going to stop the render, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, enable the tessellation. This is going to increase the tessellation, meaning it's going to have more points and more detail in it. The geometry will, but only in render time. If you set it to smooth, it's going to smooth out all the ridges. I do not want to do that. I'm going to disable smooth. So for example, if you have a box and you enable the smooth, it's going to smooth it out. It's gonna make it a circle. Like it's almost like you subdivide it. But if you do not smooth, then it's gonna keep the same information, just more detail. And that's gonna be visible when we apply our displacement or whatever else. You can already see that the object has more detail to it. I'm gonna come here onto my material again, and I'm gonna click Alt and duplicate the original material that we had. Then we're gonna come in here and let's select the the displacement, and let's connect the displacement directly into the surface here so that we can see what information is this displacement going to give us. And this is the information that the displacement will give us, okay? So let's stop the render and let's just set up what our displacement will be. And in this case, I'm not going to use a displacement. I'm just going to use a bump because I know that the bump is going to give me a decent result and it's going to be quite fast. So for the bump, let's set that to a 0.01. And let's connect this into our bump here. I'm going to hit save. And let's render again. Now you can already see we're getting something much more detailed. Now I am feeling like I'm gonna tweak a few things here on our material. So covering the basics of what materials here in Redshift do. This is the diffuse, which basically controls the color. The reflection controls the reflections, as it says, But if you increase the roughness, it's just gonna blur out the reflections, and it's very nice to play with the roughness instead of reducing your reflection. So I recommend playing with that. Additionally, you have your IOR, which basically controls the intensity of the reflection. So if we crank up our AOR, it's just gonna make it like more shiny. Our transmission, if you set the transmission to 1, it's gonna make it basically glass. We do not want to do that, and we're not going to mess with the texture, the transmission here, nor the subsurface, because the subsurface is basically going to allow light to come into the object. And here with the scale, it controls how much light we have. We're gonna allow it to go in. So even if we do something here, like this is really nice for milk or for like for liquids, glass, and all that kind of stuff. But we're not gonna do that with this one. I do like adding a little bit of sheen to my things, my objects, because it's gonna make it like shiny like that. But we can just add a little bit. Now for the thin film, this is super cool for like those materials that are, well, we can test it. If we increase this, it's gonna give it that sort of like mixing of color. I don't remember what is a good example of this, but it's very nice for working with glass. And if we keep it at a very low amount, you can also see that it helps mix up the colors a little bit nicer in here. Let's just do it very subtly. Something like that is okay for now. The coating is gonna add like an additional layer of reflection, and in this case, let's keep it low with quite a bit of roughness to it. Of course, the emission is for like making it glow, and here you can control the opacity. So for example, if we make this black, it's gonna make your object invisible. And the overall tint, we do not want to tint it, but it is basically going to tint it if you change that. That is the basic gist. So if you, oh, the last thing is metalness. So like if you increase this, it's gonna make it metal, and the color is controlled up here. But we do not want to do that. Maybe we do it just a tiny bit, because metals are always great and it gives it that like feel of metal. I like it. I think that's something like this. So like basic overview: base controls the color, the reflection; transmission only used for glass; subsurface makes your renders very slow. I can do I think I've done videos only on subsurface. Sheen and coat are basically like that extra layer on top of the reflections that are very, very nice to play with. And that is the basic gist of the things that you can set up on your material inside of Redshift. I will be doing more tutorials, as in like adding more like textures to the roughness, mixing them up, but that's for another day. We want to finish this as a basic and just cover the most important things to get started real quick inside of Redshift. So now what we're going to do is we are going to enable our depth of field, we are going to save, and we are going to make the smooth subdivisions enabled so that we can get rid of some of these ridges that I really don't like. If you look if we look closer, let's see. So let's come in here. You will see that some of this geometry is a little wonky. Now that we've enabled the subdivision, it's gonna smooth them out. Boom. So now we've cleaned all of those up. Let's hit this button right here and let's select our color controls. With our color controls, what we're gonna do is just add a little bit of contrast. Then photographic exposure is nice. You can set your IOR here. ISO, and I'm gonna set my ISO to, say, for example, a 90. I don't really, this f-stop and all that will control like your blur and that. The vignetting is obviously adding vignetting around. The black crush amount, like if you play with the allow the crush amount, you can kind of like make your darks a little darker here. You can see how that changes it. This is your saturation here, so you can actually use desaturating here. I'm gonna actually increase our saturation so we get a little bit more of that color. Then if we set up the blooms, if you reduce this, the threshold is gonna make it more intense, and then here is the intensity. And then you can soften them a little bit if you want as well, but you can see that we're getting a little bit of that bloom here. For your flare, this is what controls like a halo around it. Same thing, if you increase your threshold, it's gonna just make it more visible, and your intensity is just gonna make it happen, and you can see a little bit of that flare happening here. The streaks are really fun to play with because they create some of those like stars that you see on some of my renders. Like if you reduce it and you increase the intensity, you will see that you start to get some of those here. But you gotta be careful with these things because they actually soften up your images a lot. So I'm just gonna increase the threshold on all of them so it's just quite a bit more subtle. And then your bokeh is what controls your depth of field, which we set up at the beginning of the tutorial. And let's real quick come here and let me show you how cool this setup is, because now you can grab your HDRI and start rotating it to get different light setups. And you can see how that light is already affecting the piece. I want to have a little bit more contrast, or I mean like maybe less exposure. And you can see that as a base with very little time, we are able to get some very interesting results. I'm gonna stop this render. Close it. And the last thing that I want to tell you guys is that if you go to your material here, to apply displacement, you want to do an RS displacement. You would connect your displacement here to your texture map, and then you would connect this to the displacement. That's going to give us your displacement. And then the last thing that you want to do is select here, enable displacement, and set that, say, for example, to a 0.01 to start, or else it's going to be pretty slow. One more camera to just get a cool beauty shot like this. And we're really going to crank up that Z depth. Remember, just hit Z on your viewport and like crank it up. Let's hit save. And the reason why I wanted to show you that is because you come here and you select, you hit save, and you want to change your camera in here so that it renders out with the new camera that we just set up. So we set it to camera 2 and it's going to change the camera. Give it a sec. And yeah, maybe I went too high with my Z depth. So let's make this a little smaller here. And let's come to our camera, increase the Z depth handle. I just want to get a cool shot. So check out the very quick sort of render results that you can get with Redshift. This is without coming into any editing, without any comp. And maybe in this case, just for the sake of the tutorial, I'll show you guys that if we increase our vignetting, the edges are gonna get dark, and that really helps it feel a little bit more cinematic. Alright guys, I hope you like this tutorial, and of course, as always, I will be back with more.